So again, thank you for coming and thank you for watching the video afterwards if you're doing that. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about facilitating on-farm trials, which is something that we've been exploring in a variety of programs from all those different institutions that you can see there, especially ADAs and Innovative Farmers, but our trials that we've been doing under the umbrella of the FarmPEP program has been mostly with AACC, so it's been a very interesting process. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about facilitating them. What are top tips to make it work? What are certain challenges that you should sort of like consider when doing facilitating on-farm trials? And if you have any questions at any point, feel free to just interrupt because I can't really see anyone. So again, today the agenda is going to be quite straightforward. We're going to go through the presentation. Again, anytime you have any questions, just ask. But otherwise, we're going to be talking about a little bit about the rationale for doing this kind of things. What are on-farm trials? Certain top tips and some real cases as well. So the rationale for having on-farm trials is that the way that we innovate has been changing through the years. So in the 70s, it was all about technology transfer, where like a researcher would create some information and then it would be passed to the users. Then through the 80s and the 90s, we moved into a model that's more recognized as a client model, where you're basically trying to get the client involved and try to solve a problem that they have, but they basically present you with a problem. You kind of develop a solution, present the client with a solution and see what happens. To a model now that's more about discovering what the challenge is and how we can solve it. And there's different times when different models work. So sometimes you might want to use a knowledge transfer model. So just like if you have a very simple problem that you know exactly how to solve, you probably don't need to go into a super long field lab sort of like journey working together. But if you have a very complex problem or a problem that you'd like to explore in more detail, then probably what you want to do is get involved in this process, which is way longer, but can be way more satisfactory towards the end as well. So if I can make this work, here we go. And one of the main values that these kind of models have is the fact that you can actually address all the ways that people learn. So you're basically ensuring, not ensuring, but maximizing your opportunities of people actually getting something out of it. So some people learn by doing things. Some people learn by being told things. Some people learn by trying to challenge ideas and get people to convince them. And some people really like to see stuff. The beauty of on-farm trials or field labs is that you can actually cover all these aspects, and so different people that have different styles or mixed styles can learn a little bit better and in a way that actually suits their interests. So at the end of the day, what you get is a better learning experience and, more importantly, way more possibilities of uptake. And there's also this really interesting aspect that we tend to forget sometimes, but is the fact that social learning really, really helps people get engaged in the process. And again, increases the possibilities of uptake, but it's also a nicer experience. So that's always nice. Like if you like, some people really loved school, some people hated it. And part of it is like the experience. So one of the beauties of this kind of processes is that it really creates engagement and therefore a better possibility of people enjoying the experience, learning new ways of knowing, and changing their practices, which is what finally we're trying to potentially do. There's a million sort of like benefits and challenges, but we've identified a few that are really important. So there's something about de-risking testing ideas. If you're a farmer, you probably don't have millions of money lying around, or more importantly, a gazillion amounts of time. So having this opportunity to actually get together and think about how to take less risk while still testing ideas is always really interesting. You also need the opportunity to see farmers as knowledge creators and not just users. And that sort of like really helps because innovations are not always practical, simple, or easy to use. And they also create different kinds of work. So if you can actually work with a farmer to address these potential challenges, that really helps. It also helps you develop better tools that actually work in real life. And I would say that's the main benefit of on-farm trials, is that you're actually testing in real life, and that really helps one, uptake afterwards, but also just make sure that what you're testing is actually going to have an impact. And it also sort of like addressed the one size fits all, which is one of the big pitfalls in sort of like research, especially when it comes to agriculture. We all know that it's not only that one field is different from another. We all know that different years are different from others. So it's a way to address the immense variability that you can see in on-farm work. It also allows you to integrate all the skills into everyday farming practices. People are testing as they're doing, and they can tell you what works and what doesn't work. It really strengthens relationships, which is fantastically nice if you're especially an advisor working with farmers. And learning together usually helps uptake as well. And again, as I've mentioned, this also comes with challenges. So the biggest challenge for bringing people together is that you need to make sure that people get engaged, and that takes time and effort. You also need a good structure from the start, and you need to moderate your ambition a little bit. These are very complex processes, so you have to try to really hone in on what the idea, what the main goal is, and how to make it work. And you also need to make sure that you have the right set of the right structure to test the idea. So you need some support from experts in terms of understanding what you're going to measure, how you're going to measure it, and how you're going to analyze it from the get-go. Communication is also an issue, because you will have to be constantly communicating, which doesn't mean constantly calling people. It's just making sure that you're present throughout the whole process, that you support them in collecting the data. The challenges building trust takes time, but also you have to find effective ways to share the results, and that is crucial. So it's very interesting and quite rewarding, but it's not without a certain amount of challenges. And a way of thinking about it that can be really useful is thinking of this spiral of initiatives. So you have an initial idea, then you move into the inspiration. So someone comes with an idea, then you start sort of like trying to hone it down. Then you move into the planning of how you're going to test this idea, how you're going to implement it on the ground. And this area, if you see, takes a big chunk of the process. So you should always think that phase one should take a lot of time, because that's where you build the trust, that's where you create the ideas, and that's where you agree about how things are going to be done. If you see, two of them are in orange, and that means warm processes. Those are super creative processes where the energy is really easy to easy to create. People are throwing ideas on the table, getting inspired, thinking, how do we do it? But then you need to move into the planning stage, which tends to be more of a cold process, which means like it's all about planning, and it's about sitting on the desk and thinking about it. Having awareness of the fact that it's different kind of energies, I find it quite useful, because it means that it will be a little bit more toned down, and that's fine. Then you're going to have to implement it, which is that development and realization part. Development is running the process. Realization is collecting the data and understanding what it means. And then the final aspects are dissemination and embedding, which goes a line somewhere between phase 2 and 3, interpreting and learning the process. So Susie, do you want to take over? Because ADAS has created 5 amazing principles for success, which I find really useful when thinking about facilitating these processes.
Yeah, we've been running 1 to 200 on-farm trials a year for the last 7 years maybe, and these are the principles that have sort of crystallized out of that from the mistakes we've made and the things that have gone well. The first one is collaboration. So a lot of farmers have done split fields and little trials on farm on their own, but those results never leave the farm, and so nobody else learns from them. And there's a limit to what one farmer can learn from one trial. But if a group of farmers or advisors run the same trial and then pool their results, they can learn so much more from that kind of replication. And we can get collaborations between farmers and researchers, where we're each bringing our different skills and knowledge, between agronomists, farmers. So yeah, getting the different types of people and the replication from multiple farms is just creates so much synergy and so much better understanding. And so we encourage anyone who's considering a trial to talk to their neighbours, talk to their agronomists, go to AHDB monitor farm meetings, any way of finding collaborators, and then either discussing in person or using great online tools like this. And then after the process, sharing the results.
The next one. Next one.
Then there's a challenge, particularly for anyone who's been involved in more traditional agricultural research, like small plot trials, is you get used to testing a lot of things in one trial. 6 different nitrogen rates or 10 different fungicides or varieties. But in an on-farm trial, that just doesn't work. It's not just a giant plot trial. And so we find things go best if people test just ideally one new idea or input or approach compared to the farm standard, what they have been doing or would otherwise do, at a very maximum 3 or 4 treatments, because otherwise you can't fit them in the field. You can't replicate them because there's no space, and it all becomes burdensome and time-consuming and complicated. The trial's more likely to fall through because of that, and you learn less at the end of it. So simple treatments, and before starting, thinking, is this worth doing? So a little bit of research to find out, is the answer already out there? Can I learn from work that someone else has been done? Do I need to do this trial? And then if you do, kind of count the costs. Have I got what I need to make it work? We haven't got that.
Got it.
I'll just talk through the other ones. So
the other two sort of like just are more examples that you're going to talk about further. Yeah. But if you want to give a wee flavor of the underlying variation, replication, and assessments.
I couldn't remember what the other slides we had were. My fault. So the underlying variation, anyone who's connected to farming knows that fields are not even, and the best part of any field will be maybe 50% higher yielding than the worst part of the field, sometimes twice as high yielding, and that difference is bigger than any difference you're going to get between treatments in a trial. And so if we don't set out a trial carefully with respect to the variation, then you risk biasing it very badly. If, for example, a field used to be 2 different fields that have been joined together, those 2 halves will remain different for years or even decades. And if you split a field down the same line with 2 treatments, then they're always going to yield differently. And if you think that's the treatment rather than the variation, you'll draw a false conclusion. And so any land-based trial, we recommend that people look at a soil map or a past yield map, look at Google Earth or NDVI imagery, satellite imagery, anything to tell you where the different parts of the field are, which tend to be consistent from year to year, and try and split the field up for different treatments such that if there's no difference between them, you'd expect those areas to yield about the same. And then, if possible, to replicate the treatments. I talked about how easy it is to draw a false conclusion from a split field, because if you cut any field in half that's been farmed consistently, the two halves won't yield exactly the same. But if you have a stripe of one treatment, one or two tram lines, and then the same of your control, and then repeat that across the field, so it's like a stripy field, if there is a difference, it'll be really convincing. You'll know you've got something, whether that's from looking at it, putting it across a weighbridge, looking at the yield map. So yeah, the principle of replication that you see in every type of science is just as valuable here, and it's worth the extra effort. And then finally, thinking right at the planning stage, how am I going to assess this trial? Do I have yield mapping? Am I going to put it across a weighbridge? Do I need to send some samples off for tissue assessment during the season, or go out and have a look at the disease or the weeds? What's appropriate will depend on what we're testing, but it needs to be planned at the outset or it won't happen. It'll get forgotten at a busy time of year, and then all that effort setting it up will go to waste. Back to you, Hannah.
Yeah, no, this is sort of like, it kind of drills down a little bit on some of the things that you've mentioned, but also more social aspects that you need to consider when doing some of these field labs or on farm trials. And the first one, and the most important one, I've found over and over, there's a few really important ones, but the ones on the top are really, really crucial. And the first one is just understanding your participants' schedules. If you're going to be working with farmers or advisors, make sure that you actually know when their high times are and try to avoid those. So there are some times in the year where farmers, rightly so, are going to be so busy that it's hard for them to even answer the phone. If they're lambing, if they're sowing, if they're harvesting, avoid those times and make sure that you prepare in advance if you're going to need anything happening on those times, because most likely at that point, people are going to be on autopilot, just working what they need to do. So anything that you need to do on those pinch points, just do it beforehand. I think definitely for farmers with livestock, I would definitely consider either lambing or calving. But arable, Susie, when would you say is sort of like try to avoid time massively?
Well, it's best to be planning experiments in the winter. So yeah, doing as much planning in December and January as possible, so that when it gets dry out there and people can get on the land, it's all set up and they know what they're doing. And then, yeah, obviously harvest is, so minimizing any extra work at harvest, which is why I love yield mapping, because then someone can just harvest a field, forgetting that the trial is there. And then when things are quiet again, the data will exist somewhere.
Somewhere, you'll find it.
Yeah.
And that really takes us neatly into the right space and tools, which is absolutely crucial. You need to understand if you have the space to do what you want to do. Sometimes the farm or the space where you would like to test an idea is not ideal for testing that particular concept. So do keep that in mind and make sure that you have the right tools to assess what you're going to be testing. So in the case of ADAS, for example, it's having the right machinery and having the right data collection. If you're going to be doing something more on the agroecological side of things, make sure that you have the right tools, which could be just like making sure that the right person is available to count something. It doesn't really matter. It could be super technical. It could be very low tech. But either way, you're going to need the tools. And that's something that you should be considering in those first early stages, those 3 first early stages we mentioned at the beginning. Then you're also going to need a facilitator, and that's really important. Someone in the group, usually it's you if you're leading the process, but it could be someone else. But make sure that someone is the person who's in charge of keeping it all moving. If you don't have one lead, it tends to just fall through the wayward because everybody's busy. Being a facilitator doesn't mean having to be there all the time. It's just keeping an eye to make sure that on the critical dates, people are aware of what happens, and making sure that you have created a plan that actually can be implemented and following through with it. So making sure that you're keeping an eye on it. And it also is usually up to that person to keep communicating through the process. And communicating, again, as I mentioned, sometimes it's about a call, sometimes it's about organizing a meeting, but it could also be like keeping a WhatsApp group and keeping it lively and sending a few really relevant articles or asking a relevant question at that point that will bring everybody to the table, even if for 5 minutes. And that's where having, yeah, go ahead.
Just going to say, I find that different people communicate in different ways.
Absolutely.
So if it was up to me, I'd do everything by email, but a lot of farmers are not so hot on email. And so I've got to learn, you know, which people I work with like things by email, who would much rather I just picked up a phone and talked it through with them, who welcomes just text message reminders at key times. And I've got some farmers like to do everything by WhatsApp, and if I send an email, I'll get everything back on WhatsApp.
Yeah, I'm a WhatsApp and call kind of person, so I definitely agree with that. If you send me an email, I might see it, I might not, but if you send something to my phone, I'll definitely see it. So
it's being adaptable to work with the group that you've got. And
I would say definitely one thing to consider is at the very beginning of a process and at the very end of a process, if you can do an in-person meeting, that's always amazing, because it really brings the whole process together, and it's a great opportunity to kickstart a process and to celebrate that you've made it through the other side. So I would highly recommend that at the very end and at the very beginning, at the very end, and nice food. I'm not sure what you think, Susie, but I think
and at a quiet time of year. So yeah, when we have a farmer meeting to talk through results, it's in December or January.
Yeah. Trust is crucial, and trust is created at the very early stages where you're defining a shared goal. So just make sure that you actually take the time in that first phase. Sometimes we're so eager to be on the planning phase or on the developing phase that we kind of forget how important it is to make sure that we have the right shared idea, shared goals, shared challenges. So take the time at the very beginning, and if you think you're going to need a month, take a month and a half, because it's usually a little bit longer than you would expect that whole process, and just put a lot of energy there. That's sort of like time and energy well spent for the whole of the rest of the process. And in that line, just make sure that you're actually tackling things that the farmers really want to challenge or explore. Like it's if it's something that is interesting for them, there's way higher chances of following through. Like any human being, we do what interests us. So just make sure that it actually helps them solve something in their farm. And make sure that you have the right environmental conditions. We were thinking, and Susie's going to talk about it in a second, but the conditions on a farm are always changing. Make sure that you're reacting to those. We're going to see that, for example, some of the trials that we did were in a year where there was, for some reason, a lot of nitrogen going around. So understanding that from the very beginning will help you draw the right conclusions. That kind of neatly takes us to source the right knowledge, talk to experts, talk to your neighbors, make sure that you're sort of like testing the right idea with the right knowledge, and make it as simple as possible, and try to test ideas with other people. Communication with your neighbor, that's always sort of like the best way to get a really good handle of what's happening on the ground. And once it's done, once you've had all this information, once you've gone through the whole process, turn it into practical advice. No one's gonna, I mean, it's really important to have a report and everything at the end of the day, but once you finish the whole process, turn it into practical advice that can be handed hand to hand to someone else. So take the time to analyze the data, but at the end of the day, it's all about that practical advice and communicating results in an easy way. Because you never know when the next trial is around the corner, just because you mentioned it to someone that was interested in it. So I think that this is all the theoretical side. And Susie, why am I saying Lucy? I'm handing it over to you so that we can talk about the results of what we did.
So these were trials carried out in the FarmPEP project. It's a collaboration between AICC advisors, their farmer clients, and a little bit of support from ADAS. In 2022, most of the trials, in fact, in both years, were focused on nutrition because with the sudden rise in fertilizer prices about a year and a half ago, that was the hot topic that everybody wanted to look at. Everyone wants to save a bit of fertilizer. And so we were looking at nitrogen rates and at products which are marketed as improving nitrogen efficiency or replacing some of the bad nitrogen, biostimulant products, efficiency fertilizers, inhibitor products, all that sort of thing. In the first season of trials, I think there were 11 trials initiated, of which 9 kind of finished well and returned results, which is, it's not a bad ratio. You're always going to lose some farm trials due to problems during the season. And it was really interesting bringing them all together because we saw a consistent pattern across the trials of lower than expected optimum nitrogen rates, that farmers were dropping the nitrogen rate far further than they would normally consider in the trial, and actually not losing much yield at all, improving their gross margin. And when we discussed that among the advisors and the farmers involved, we also learned that a lot of them had seen high residual nitrogen in soil tests. They had the Yara N tester giving low recommendations. We'd heard about companies running small plot nitrogen response trials and getting low optima. And so by pooling all of that information, we concluded that in that season, we'd had a dry and mild winter, which must have increased mineralization in the soil and given very little leaching, so that soil nitrogen supplies were high coming out of winter. And so that's why we could get away with low bag nitrogen rates. And so it was a great example of how collaboration gave us so much more than any one trial. And some of the trials were not as well designed as they could have been. We had quite a low, not very much replication, and 1 or 2 of them had some real problems with underlying variation. And so by repeating the project in 2023, we saw a big improvement in trial designs. People had really taken on board the messages about replication and checking out the variation in the field. And so you can see that trial design at the bottom was one of the 2023 designs that was beautifully replicated with different biostimulant treatments interspersed with a control treatment. And by looking at satellite imagery, we could see just maybe some small effects from nitrogen reductions there. So I think the process has been quite educational, both in what we've learned about the treatments we tested, but also about how to do trials well.
Let me move into the main learnings then, and you can sort of like walk us through them.
Yeah, so as we said, keeping it simple. Some of those trials in 2022 had 6 treatments in, which was hard work and removed any possibility of replication. I think people have found their simpler trials in 2023 easier and more informative. The importance of a benchmark or a control treatment. There's no point just testing new ideas without comparing them against what we're already doing. We won't know if it's better. The importance of understanding the baseline and when we're going to do things. and picking the right field. So some fields are just not suitable for trials. They're too small, they're too variable. And so a little bit of time thinking and planning, do I have the right field, is worthwhile. And occasionally the answer is no, I can't do that trial on my farm in this season. It will be a waste of everybody's time because my fields are not suitable. So let's leave it till next year when the rotation will be different or the conditions will be different. Yeah, thinking about the tools, as I said, and the time and the availability. So about the capacity to run a trial well, because usually it can be done with enough planning, but just occasionally the answer is this is not the trial for me. Replication and repeating can be within a field with replicate tramlines. It can be repeating it across multiple farms or multiple fields, and it can be repeating across seasons. So I talked about the mild, dry winter we had between 2021 and 2022, which is a complete contrast to the winter that we're just coming out of, where I imagine that all the nitrogen has leached away. There's very little left in the soil. Everything's different this season. So we need patience in every sort of agricultural science. We can only learn so much from one season. And if something's really worth doing, it's worth doing across several years. And then question of boldness in testing. We need to be bold enough to try ideas that will actually make a difference. If you try testing a 20 kilo difference in nitrogen, you just won't see a difference. A treatment has to be bold enough that you might actually see a difference, but not so bold that you're testing something that you would never do in real life, and that's not going to risk too much yield. So there's things that we do in small plot trials with untreated areas that would be a very bad idea in an on-farm trial. You wouldn't leave a strip untreated by herbicide, for example, or you'd lose too much yield and leave a huge problem for next year. And then finally, the thinking about results and reports and how things should be communicated. We've spent a long time thinking about how to walk the line between proper science and proper stats and being understandable to people for whom science and stats is not their area of expertise. And the right answer there will depend on the audience and the people involved in a project.
From an outside perspective, I think that this was probably one of the most interesting things for me, because the reports were quite technical and people really enjoyed that, but having it mixed with a session where the experts were actually explaining what you meant, but also bringing people together allowed us both to make more sense of the reports, but also come to all those sort of like more general understandings that Susie was talking about before. So for example, around the nitrogen amount on the soil and things like that, which would have not been possible if it was just a matter of you talking to your individual farmer about a result. So there was definitely a huge amount of value on taking the time to come together, check the results, compare results from a very technical standpoint, but also from a practical one. So I thought that was really interesting in terms of what we did. And I think this is about the sort of like two final ideas, which Susie has mentioned, so go ahead.
Yeah, these are just a couple of examples of trials from the second year, from 2023. So there's not huge amount of replication because that wasn't very practical for what they were testing here with 2 different drills. But even having one block of a test treatment with the control, the farm standard on both sides, is a level of replication because you've got 2 different boundaries between treatments where if you see a step change in yield, you really learn something. And these images are the yield maps that have been cleaned and analysed using the ADAS agronomics process. And if you don't see any change in yield at those treatment boundaries, that's because there wasn't. Both of those trials showed basically identical yields to quite a high degree of accuracy between the 2 different drills that were used, which is informative in itself. We don't have to see a big treatment difference to learn something from a trial. Not seeing a difference can be just as important a result. So here the farmers can learn that if he wants to buy, that new horse drill, is not going to lose him any yield. It's not going to gain him any, so he can make the decision based on what's cheapest and most efficient to use. The other things that you consider beyond yield.
And I think that's one thing that we tend to forget. I just realized we've not put it further. I mean, in the slide about the things to consider when doing an on-farm trial, but the fact that no results or even failure is a result in itself and should be, not sure if celebrated, but definitely shared with other people. That's a really, really important aspect to consider.
So a lot of those nitrogen efficiency products that we've tested in this series of trials gave very disappointing results, but well, they'd be disappointing for the manufacturers anyway. But it means that we learn that maybe some of those are not worth what they cost, and not spend a lot of money on them. So yeah, there are a lot of products on the market with a lot of big claims that sometimes seem too good to be true, and you don't want to just pass them up because maybe they are amazing, but you don't want to just take it on trust. Giving them a try on farm is a great way to cut through that confusion.
100%. I can't agree more. And I think that's sort of like mostly what we wanted to share with you today in terms of what we've learned from the field labs and some ideas of what can be useful and how to use it. We will be creating a short article with all this information. We'll upload this recording as well, but you're going to be able to find everything on the FarmPEP website. So Susie, do you want to talk a little bit about that as well?
Yes, so this is a website that was set up a couple of years ago, I guess. And the aim is that it's a bit like a Wikipedia of farming. So it's a collaborative endeavour where you can register and you can add information. If you do a trial or a project and you learn something new, this is where you can easily share it with the world and you can learn from what other people have done. So there's a lot of articles on a couple of 100 topics that have been written by experts in ADAS and other organisations. There's information about events, so like this event, and shows and talks and webinars. There's resources, trial reports, grace guides on. There's a lot about arable farming on there. There's a growing amount about livestock, regen ag, and that sort of thing. Very little on horticulture at the moment, but there's plans to increase that. And yeah, you can add comments. There's space for discussion there. So yeah,
as I mentioned, yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead. I interrupted you. Sorry.
I was just going to say, it's when planning a project, it's a great place to go to see what is already known and whether it's a trial worth running. And then afterwards, it's a great place to go to share the results. Sorry, Anna.
So again, if you're interested, just go there, but we'll also put all the information that we've just shared there in an article with also some links, relevant links to things that might be useful. For example, tool repositories where you can find a lot of tools that might help you organize events, for example, organize facilitations. You don't have to start from scratch. There's a lot of knowledge out there that you can already use. And a few projects that might be relevant if on-farm trials is the thing that you're interested in. So some links probably to the living labs that are happening all around Europe. Some of the definitely innovative farmers, which we definitely recommend you visit. There's a lot of information in there. And a few other bits and pieces, plus our contact information in case you have any questions.